Welcome to Emavira Audiobooks. Tonight we're telling the story of a woman who signs her name for a living and what happened the day she found somebody else's name where it had no business being. Her name is Nessa Kirwan. She is not a detective. She is a completion specialist, a quiet, unglamorous job that involves checking that every certificate, every inspection, every scrap of paperwork at the tail end of a huge construction project actually matches the concrete and steel it claims to describe. 4 days into a contract at a remote dam in regional Queensland, Nessa Kirwan finds a certificate signed by an engineer who has been dead for years. And the longer she looks at it, the more she becomes convinced that the signature is only the beginning of what someone in this small, close-knit town has spent a very long time trying to keep buried. This is a story about a valley that depends on one company for its living, about a father's silence that outlived him, and about the particular, patient courage it takes to keep asking a question everybody around you would very much prefer you stopped asking. Settle in. This one builds slowly, the way the truth usually does, and it does not let you look away from the ending. This is The Final Certificate, a fictional crime story, and this is Emavira Audiobooks. Our story opens on an ordinary Thursday morning in an open-plan office that hummed faintly with the sound of a hydraulic system 200 meters away, doing its quiet, invisible work. Nessa Kirwan was 4 days into a 6-month contract at Corravale Dam, and she had already learned, in 3 years of this kind of work, to trust the particular unease that had settled over her that morning like a change in the weather. On her second monitor sat a scan certificate, pulled from an archive folder for the isolation valve chamber beneath the dam's auxiliary spillway. It was a State Water Queensland inspection form, properly formatted, properly numbered, signed by an inspecting engineer named Walter Voss. The date on the certificate was March of 2019. The trouble was that Walter Voss had died in November of 2016. She found his obituary by accident first, buried in an unrelated file, and then again on purpose, some stubborn part of her hoping to be told she was simply mistaken. There was no mistake. Corravale's local paper had run a photograph of him on the crest of the very dam she now worked beside, squinting into the sun, survived by 2 children and a devoted community. She printed that obituary, which her job never required of her, because some part of her wanted the dead man's face in front of her while she decided what to do with his signature. Her colleague Priya Chandran arrived at her desk at 9, as she did every morning, coffee in hand, and read over Nessa's shoulder long enough for her expression to slide from amusement into something considerably more serious. Nessa explained the discrepancy plainly. A man who had been in the ground for 3 years had apparently kept inspecting the auxiliary spillway from beyond it. Priya offered the obvious, generous explanation first, a typo, perhaps, or a junior partner simply continuing to use an old letterhead for convenience after a client asked for continuity. It was, Nessa privately thought, exactly the kind of boring, uncharitable-to-nobody theory she had built her whole career on preferring, because 9 times out of 10 the boring theory was the correct one. But when she pulled the file's metadata, the document had been created, not merely modified, in March of 2019, the same day as 2 other certificates in the batch, both also carrying Voss's signature, both for structures completed well after he had died. It was not a typo. It was a pattern. Nessa found herself thinking of a lesson her very first induction supervisor, a woman named Farah, had given her years earlier. Documents do not lie on their own. People lie, and then they make the documents agree with them. A completion specialist's real job, Farah had told her, was never to catch the paperwork. It was to catch the person who had made the paperwork lie. What Nessa did not yet know, standing at her desk with a dead man's signature glowing on her screen, was how far back that particular lie would eventually reach, or how much of her own family's silence it was quietly connected to. She had driven up from Brisbane 11 days earlier, 6 hours of highway narrowing at last into cane country, then cattle country, then hills green enough to surprise her, the reservoir appearing around a bend as though it had been waiting for her arrival. Corravale itself was a small town built almost entirely around one thing, the dam, and the company that had built and now maintained it, Halloran Vance Civil, which employed close to a third of the working adults for 40 kilometers in every direction. Already she had noticed how carefully people in town spoke about the company, the way you speak about whether that could still turn on you. She had told the recruiter, taking the job, that 6 months in a quiet Queensland town suited her fine after 3 years of noisy capital city sights. That had even been true. What she hadn't expected was that the quiet here would have this particular shape, a town that seemed, the longer she stayed, to be holding its breath about something it could not quite name. The remediation and upgrade of Corravale Dam had, in one form or another, been running for 11 years by the time Nessa arrived for its final 6 months. Her job was to reconcile 11 years of certificates, inspections and drawings against the physical structure State Water Queensland was about to formally take ownership of, a desk job, in theory, though in practice it meant spending long afternoons in a converted shipping container behind the main office that everyone at Halloran Vance called, without any apparent irony, the Sunny Files, after a cheerful sun someone had painted on the door years earlier, and nobody had ever bothered to repaint. There she found 19 certificates carrying Walter Voss's signature. 12 predated his death and looked entirely legitimate, written in the small, careful hand of an engineer who had trained before computers and never fully trusted them. 7 postdated it, and every one of the 7 concerned the same structure, the isolation valve chamber, a below-ground room built into the base of the spillway to house the mechanism that let the dam be drained for maintenance without draining the reservoir behind it. Laid side by side, the 7 forged signatures troubled her in a way she hadn't expected. They were too consistent, the same confident loop, over and over, with none of the small natural variation a real hand produces across years of writing. When she found a genuine pre-2016 signature to compare them against, the difference leapt out at her immediately. The real Voss signature carried a tiny hesitation in the crossbar of the T, a habit. The 7 forgeries had no hesitation at all. They looked traced rather than written. It was while she was studying them that a senior structural engineer named Callan Doyle appeared in the doorway, informing her, not quite warmly, that she wasn't supposed to be in the archive without supervision. When she pointed out that her induction pack said otherwise, he came in anyway, glanced at the table, and something in his face did a small, fast thing before smoothing back into professional blandness. Asked directly about the discrepancy, he offered an explanation that came out a little too easily for Nessa's liking. Voss's practice had simply continued operating under his junior partner after his death, at the client's request, for the sake of continuity, and he could dig up the handover paperwork to prove it if she wanted it for her files. He never produced that paperwork. Not that day, not the next, and when Nessa followed up by email later in the week, his reply promised he was chasing it up, and then nothing further arrived at all. What she noticed most, replaying the encounter afterward, was the particular quality of the silence Doyle left behind him, not the ordinary irritation of a busy man being interrupted, but something more watchful, the specific quiet of a person who has just finished performing calm rather than felt it. By Friday, she had stopped waiting on Doyle and started asking Priya instead, quietly, over coffee, whether anyone in procurement kept records of payments made to outside consulting engineers over the life of the project. Somewhere, she was increasingly certain, there was an invoice trail, and invoice trails, unlike people, did not get politely reworded when someone leaned on them. Priya, who had spent 6 years at Halloran Vance learning exactly which admin staff owed her favors, promised results within a week, and relished the assignment rather more than her job description technically allowed. It was Priya, too, who noticed something else worth squinting at. The Sunny Files container had been rekeyed twice in 3 years, both times shortly after a completions review had been scheduled. It could be nothing. Companies rekeyed things all the time. But it was, as Priya put it, the kind of nothing that started to look like a pattern once you'd already stopped trusting the obvious explanation for anything else. Priya found the payment records in 4 days, which she considered slow-going and Nessa considered close to miraculous, given that Halloran Vance's accounting system had survived 2 software migrations since 2016 and kept its own history the way a hoarder keeps a garage. The name on the invoices was Voss and Tran Consulting Engineers, paid every quarter, without interruption from 2014, before Voss's death, all the way through to 8 months before Nessa's arrival. The payments had not shrunk after 2016. If anything, they had crept steadily upward, small increases that looked, on their own, like nothing more than a routine escalation clause. What struck Nessa hardest was the payee detail. The same business number had been used the entire time. On paper, at least, Voss and Tran had never closed. Someone was still operating that identity, invoicing a live company for work signed off by a dead man, and someone at Halloran Vance had been approving those invoices quarter after quarter for 3 years running. It took only a day more to track down Voss's actual junior partner, and the discovery reframed everything. Selena Tran had left Australia in early 2017, only months after Voss's funeral, and was now, and had been for the better part of 8 years, a structural engineer for a highway authority in Ontario. She had not signed those 7 certificates. She very likely had no idea her old firm's business number was still active at all. So, who was cashing the checks? That question sat between Nessa and Priya on a late call that evening, both of them still at their desks long after the office had emptied. Neither of them liked where the answer seemed to be heading. If this was what it looked like, Priya said carefully, they were no longer talking about a paperwork scandal. They were talking about someone with money, lawyers, and years of comfortable practice at keeping this exact arrangement running. Nessa admitted, more honestly than she'd allowed herself to before, that she could still walk away from this, hand what she had to State Water's compliance people and let them take it from here, and go back to being a completions specialist checking concrete against drawings like anyone else on a normal contract. But every time she pictured doing that, she pictured someone quietly making the 7 certificates disappear before an official ever laid eyes on them, and she had already watched how quickly her own access could be narrowed the moment somebody decided she was asking the wrong questions. There was no version of this, she realized, where she got to simply unknow it. There was only a version where she knew and acted, and a version where she knew and didn't, and she would have to live with whichever one she chose. She meant it, mostly, as the kind of thing people say before they've fully believed it themselves, and only understood how much she had meant it an hour later, when she found herself checking that her apartment door was locked from the inside, a habit she hadn't needed in years. Working alone later that night, she cross-referenced the 7 forged dates against the project's day-to-day site diary and found that 3 of them lined up, within a day, with entries recording unusual geotechnical monitoring readings taken near the isolation valve chamber. She underlined the correlation twice and sat a long while afterward in the empty office, listening to the hydraulic hum through the walls, wondering exactly what kind of readings needed a dead man's signature to explain away. There was a reason Nessa had chosen this particular contract over 2 others that paid better and asked less of her, and it was not a reason she had shared with the recruiter, with Priya, or with anyone at Halloran Vance. Her father had worked on the original construction of Corravale Dam back in 1998, a rigger in his early 30s, spending one summer hanging steel over the spillway crest before the family moved south, and he never spoke of the job again. She had been 6 years old at the time. What she remembered was mostly texture, diesel on his overalls, a toy crane he had made her from offcuts, the way he would stand at the kitchen window some evenings simply looking north, as though the valley had followed the family home. What she had pieced together later, from overheard arguments and one unusually candid conversation at her own 21st birthday, was that something had happened on that site he refused to discuss, that he had left heavy construction within the year and never returned to it, and that whenever Corravale came up in conversation his jaw would tighten in a particular way, a way she now recognized, from her own mirror, as the shape a person's face makes when choosing not to say something true. He had died 4 years earlier, suddenly, of a heart condition no one had seen coming, not unlike Walter Voss, if she allowed herself to think of it that way. She told herself, gripping the wheel a little too tightly on the drive up through the switchbacks above the reservoir, that she had not come to Corravale to solve any mystery about her father. She had come because the contract was good, the timing worked, and it was exactly the kind of complex handover that built a completion specialist's reputation. And yet, on her very first night in town, she had driven to the dam wall alone in the dark and stood at the lookout, staring at the black shape of the spillway against a sky thick with stars the city never let her see, and had felt something settle in her chest that was not quite grief and not quite curiosity, but some third thing without a clean name. She went back to that same lookout more than once in the weeks that followed, as though some part of her expected the valley to eventually explain itself if she stood there long enough. It never did. The reservoir sat black and patient below the wall, giving nothing away, the way it had presumably given nothing away to her father either. She had brought with her, tucked into the back of a notebook, one of the only surviving photographs of him from that year, younger than she was now, sunburnt, grinning under a hard hat with an arm around a man she didn't recognize, the spillway crest visible behind them confirming it had been taken here, at Corravale. She found herself taking it out some evenings, wondering whether the stranger in the photograph was still alive somewhere, and whether he remembered the same summer her father had spent the rest of his life refusing to discuss. Her mother, on the rare occasions Nessa had raised it, always offered the same well-worn answer, that men of that generation simply didn't talk about work the way people did now, that a hard season on a difficult site was reason enough for a man to want a fresh start. Somewhere the mountains wouldn't remind him of it. It had always sounded like an answer polished smooth by repetition rather than one that had ever actually satisfied the person giving it. There was one more detail the valley kept returning to her. Her father had always kept a single unopened bottle of a particular imported beer at the back of the family fridge, a brand nobody else in the household drank, replaced quietly whenever it neared its use-by date. Asked once who it was for, he had answered only an old mate, in a tone that closed the subject before she'd finished forming her next question. Driving the valley roads now, she found herself wondering whether that bottle had been waiting 20 years for a man who never had the chance to come and drink it. 4 weeks into her contract, with a dead engineer's forged signature spread across her desk and a company still quietly paying his ghost, Nessa spent her Saturday off at the Corravale Historical Society, asking a volunteer named Mrs. Pham whether the society kept any newspaper archive from the original 1998 construction. It did, boxes of it, unindexed, smelling of dust and old glue, stacked in what had clearly once been a broom cupboard. Mrs. Pham, well into her 70s and briskly efficient, remarked that nobody ever asked for the damn years anymore, though half the town's history depended on them. After 4 hours of clippings and a cooling cup of instant coffee, Nessa found the item she hadn't known she was looking for, 3 short paragraphs from October 1998, tucked beneath a much larger story about a council rezoning dispute. The headline read simply, "Worker injured in spillway incident, construction resumes." There was no name. There was a brief mention of a fall during formwork removal, a note that Halloran Vance's predecessor company had conducted a full safety review, and a line that stayed with her long after she'd read it 3 times over. That works were back on schedule within the week. An injury serious enough to make the local paper, and the company's public response amounted to a note about the timetable. There was no follow-up article at all, no name, no outcome, no record of whether the injured man had lived, been compensated, or simply vanished from the record the way workers sometimes did when a company decided a story was more trouble told than left untold. The local paper had run a photograph of a new footbridge the following week, and the incident appeared to have quietly stopped existing in print. Mrs. Pham studied the clipping for a long moment, reaching for a memory gone soft with age. She recalled vaguely that her late husband had driven trucks for one of the subcontractors that year, and that there had been talk at the depot of somebody being badly hurt, talk that simply stopped after a while, the way it did in a town that depended on the dam for half its living. "You didn't ask too hard," she said, "about the thing that fed you." She had no memory of a name, and doubted anyone in town would have known the man's family in any case, since half the workers came up from Cairns and Townsville for the season and went home again once it ended. Nessa photographed the clipping and sat with it a long time in the car afterward before allowing herself the thought she'd been circling ever since the archive room. What if the reason her father had never spoken about Corravale was connected to the same reason someone, 21 years later, was still forging Walter Voss's signature to keep something quiet inside that spillway? It was not, she told herself firmly, proof that her father had been involved in anything. It was, at most, reason to believe he had been there, had seen or heard something, and had carried the silence home with him the way some men carry an injury they would rather nobody examine too closely. She thought about ringing her mother that night, and didn't. There would be time for that conversation, she told herself. Once she had something more than a folded photograph and a feeling she couldn't yet defend. On her way out, Mrs. Pham mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the community hall still kept its old visitors book from around that time, people signing in for working bees and fundraisers, and that it might hold a name that had never made the paper. Nessa thanked her, and took the suggestion far more seriously than either of them let on Monday morning. Nessa's archive access was gone. Nothing dramatic, no error message, no confrontation at the door, simply quietly narrowed, the way these things always were once someone with more authority decided a line needed drawing. Her badge still opened the main office. It no longer opened the Sunny files. The site administrator explained, without much conviction, that access had been streamlined as part of a records management review, and that any documents Nessa needed could be requested through the appropriate channel, a request form that, Nessa soon discovered, routed directly to Callan Doyle's inbox. He was the gatekeeper now, she told Priya, keeping her voice low even in an empty lunchroom. Every document she wanted, he would see the request before she ever saw the file. What she needed most urgently were the 7 forged certificates themselves, the original valve chamber drawings, and an answer to a discrepancy she had found the night before, working from scans she'd already downloaded before her access closed. The 2003 drawing set, filed after an earlier repair to the chamber, showed it as a modest room, 6 meters by 4, with a single access hatch. The current 2019 drawing set, the same year the forged certificates began, showed the same chamber at roughly 2/3 that footprint, with a section of the original space now labeled, blandly, structural fill, no access. Somebody had shrunk the room, at least on paper, and in Nessa's professional experience the paper usually followed the concrete, which meant that sometime in 2019, someone had likely poured concrete into a working mechanical chamber and then quietly revised the drawings to make it look as though it had always been that way. Priya, hearing it laid out, put the darker version of it into words neither of them had quite said aloud yet. That someone had filled the chamber in deliberately and backdated the paperwork so nobody would think to ask why. Priya urged caution. If there really was something inside that chamber, something worth pouring concrete over in 2019, then pulling on this thread from a desk with no lock on the door was not a small risk. Nessa agreed she wouldn't slow down, but promised she would be careful, and reminded herself and Priya that those were not the same thing, though they weren't quite opposites either. That afternoon, she filed a formal information request, not through Halloran Vance's internal channel, but directly with State Water Queensland, reasoning that whatever gatekeeping Doyle now controlled internally, the state authority footing the bill for the handover had its own statutory right to the same documents. It felt, submitting the form, like the first genuinely unretractable move she had made in this whole quiet contest, and she sent it before she could talk herself out of it. The state water liaison who called her back within the hour, a mild, overworked man named Greg Fenimore, sounded startled by his own realization as he spoke it aloud, that a contractor restricting document access from the very person responsible for certifying a state asset handover was not a records issue, but a governance issue, and that someone considerably more senior than himself would be looking at it by Monday. True to his word, a state water compliance officer named Renata Illich rang the following afternoon, calm and unhurried in the manner of someone who had spent a career reading between the lines of contractor correspondence. She asked careful questions, recorded Nessa's answers without editorializing, and closed the call by mentioning, almost casually, that State Water's contract with Halloran Vance carried an audit clause nobody in her office had needed to invoke in roughly a decade, and that this might finally be the occasion for it. For the first time since her meeting in the archive room, Nessa felt some part of the weight she'd been carrying shift, if only slightly, onto an institution actually built to carry it. It was Priya's cousin's husband, a plumber who had worked half the trades jobs in the valley over 30 years, who first pointed Nessa towards Alan Reese, a retired structural draftsman who had, in the plumber's words, drawn half of Corravale before it existed and drunk the other half into existence at the Empire Hotel. Reese lived alone on the edge of town, in a weatherboard house with a garden gone comfortably to seed. 78 years old and sharp-eyed, he agreed to talk once Nessa had carefully explained she was simply a completions specialist trying to reconcile some old drawings, and made her tea strong enough that he didn't feel the need to apologize for it. He had worked under Walter Voss for 11 years, he told her, and had always known him as a careful, meticulous engineer, the sort who would hold up an entire concrete pour over a rebar spacing nobody else had noticed. Which was exactly why something had always sat wrong with him about what happened afterward. In 1998, a young formwork carpenter he believed was named Danny Petrakis had gone down during a strip-out on the original spillway chamber. The company's public line was that the man had recovered and gone home to family up north. The case, as far as anyone in the office was concerned, had simply been closed. Reese admitted he had never once heard from Petrakis again, nor met anyone who had, which wasn't proof of anything on its own, since people moved on. But he told her something that had stayed with him for 2 decades, that around 2004, while the two of them worked on the as-built drawings for the repaired chamber, Walter Voss had confided to him, half a bottle of something into an evening, that he had signed something for that repair he shouldn't have. He hadn't said exactly what. He had said only that the chamber hadn't been finished properly, that he'd been pressured to certify it anyway because the client was pushing hard on the handover date, and that he had regretted it every year since. Reese did not know whether Voss had ever tried to correct it, and was careful to say that having 2 children and a mortgage, and a company that fed his small practice half its work for 15 years, was not an excuse. Only, perhaps, an explanation for why a good engineer sometimes signs a bad thing. When Nessa told him plainly what she had actually found, a dead man's signature and registration number being used for 3 years after his death, on the same chamber that had been quietly resized in the drawings the very year the forgeries began. Reese set his tea down very carefully, as though his hands had suddenly become unreliable, and said only that this was not a paperwork error. Nessa agreed that she didn't think it was either. He rose slowly, favoring one knee, and retrieved a site photograph from 2003 he had clearly looked at more recently than the dust on everything else around it suggested. A dozen men in hard hats grouped loosely at the mouth of the isolation valve chamber. Walter Voss recognizable near the center, younger and smiling. He admitted he had looked at that photograph 100 times over the years and never once let himself properly wonder what the men in it were standing on top of. What she needed now, Reese told her, was not an old draftsman but someone who had actually been on that site in 1998. A retired foreman named Ted Kowalski, now living down the coast, who would have filed the original incident report if a truthful one had ever existed. At the door, Reese caught her sleeve gently and asked only that, if she learned the whole truth, she let Walter Voss's name come out the other side a little cleaner than it was about to look going in. A good man, he said, who had made one bad choice young enough that it followed him for the rest of his life. Ted Kowalski did not want to talk to her, and Nessa understood as much within seconds of him opening his front door in Yapun to find a stranger on his step with a folder under her arm. He told her flatly that he didn't do interviews, that whoever had sent her had already been told everything he knew, which was nothing. Nobody had sent her, she explained. She was a completions specialist working the Corravale handover, and she had found certificates that didn't add up, a newspaper clipping from 1998 with no name in it, and a retired draftsman named Alan Reese who thought Kowalski might remember more. Something moved behind the older man's eyes at Reese's name. Not warmth exactly, but the wariness of someone deciding whether an old colleague's referral was reason enough to risk a conversation he had spent 26 years avoiding. He led her onto the porch, no further, and offered no tea. Once she had laid out what little she had, he told her the name she'd been circling for weeks. Danny Petrakis, 24 years old, a good kid, who had gone down into the isolation chamber to strip formwork off a section poured against a schedule rushed at every level, Haller and Vance wanting the handover moved forward, the client wanting it moved forward more, nobody willing to say out loud that the concrete needed another 4 days to cure. A section had given way. Not the whole chamber, just a section, but Danny had been directly beneath it when it went. He died, Nessa said quietly. It was no longer a question. Kowalski confirmed it, and the two words seemed to cost him something physical to say aloud. He had written the incident report himself that same night, a full and honest account, fatality, cause, contributing factors, the rushed pour, all of it, and handed it to site management the following morning. The report that was filed with the State Safety Authority a week later was not the one he had written. It described a non-fatal injury, hospital treatment, recovery, and a return home to family in Cairns. His own name was still on it, his signature close enough to his own that he had never been able to prove it wasn't. When he confronted the site manager, a young and ambitious Desmond Halloran, then still building his father's company into something larger, he was told the family had been looked after, that Danny's mother had accepted a settlement and wanted no part of the publicity a fatality investigation would bring to a project half the state was already watching. He was told that if he pushed it, he would never work another Queensland site again, and neither would anyone who backed him. For 26 years, Kowalski admitted, he had wanted to believe that story, because believing it let him sleep some nights. But he had never once met Danny's mother, never seen a death certificate or a funeral notice, and when he had quietly asked around Cairns years later, he had never found a Petrakis family who'd lost a son on a Queensland dam site in 1998. Either they had moved beyond his reach, or Danny Petrakis had never gone anywhere at all. He hadn't gone to the police. because what he'd had was an altered report he couldn't prove was altered, set against a company with more lawyers than he had years left in the trade. He'd had a wife, a mortgage, a foreman's reputation that kept food on the table, and he told her plainly that none of that made his silence right, only that it explained what had happened. Before she left, Kowalski went inside and returned with a soft, age-worn cardboard box of site photographs, which he had never shown anyone because he'd never known what showing them might cost him. He was too old now, he said, to keep being the only one who remembered what was in them. Beneath curling photographs of scaffolding and concrete pours, Nessa found one image of a young man in a hard hat, laughing at something out of frame, formwork timber balanced on one shoulder. Danny Petrakis, 24 years old, and looking like a man who fully expected to be 25. Walking back to her car, with the valley wind picking up around her, Nessa arrived at a thought with a clarity that felt almost like calm. A chamber quietly resized on paper in 2019 was not concealing a structural defect. It was concealing a body that had never once left the site it had fallen on. She knew, turning it over on the long drive back to Corravale, that she probably should have gone to the police first. But 26-year-old suspicions and a handful of forged signatures were not, on their own, a body, and she had learned enough in this line of work to know that an accusation made without evidence only teaches a guilty party to hide the evidence better. What she had instead was a professional pretext, and she used it, formally requesting a meeting with Desmond Halloran, now chairman of Halloran Vance Civil, regarding documentation anomalies in the isolation valve chamber file that required executive clarification before certification could proceed. He agreed with what looked like genuine equanimity, which told her either that he had nothing to fear or that he had spent 26 years learning to look exactly like a man who had nothing to fear, and that those were two very different men wearing the identical expression. His office overlooked the reservoir through floor-to-ceiling glass, a model of the original 1998 dam displayed under a perspex case on a side table, like a trophy. He greeted her warmly, almost too warmly, mentioning that he'd heard she'd been thorough and that Denise had told him she'd had some access questions. Nessa told him she'd had some questions the access hadn't answered and set the 7 forged certificates on his desk one by one. Like cards in a hand she had no intention of bluffing with. She told him plainly what she now knew, that Voss's junior partner had been living in Ontario since 2017 and had no idea her old business number was still invoicing his company, that she had spoken to both Ted Kowalski and Alan Reese, that she had a 1998 newspaper clipping with no name in it, and a company statement claiming construction had resumed within the week of a worker's fall. She did not believe, she told him, that Danny Petrakis had ever gone home to Cairns. She did not believe he had ever left the site at all. She watched his face the way she'd watched Doyle's weeks earlier, and this time there was no flinch whatsoever. Only a long, considering stillness, the look of a man doing arithmetic behind his eyes. When he finally spoke, all the earlier warmth had gone out of his voice entirely. He reminded her that her job was to certify paperwork against physical works, not to conduct a criminal investigation into events that predated her contract by 21 years, based on the recollections of a bitter old foreman and a retired draftsman who'd had one too many at the Empire. He stood, signaling the meeting's end, and told her he would think very carefully about what she chose to put in writing. Defamation was expensive, and so was breach of contract, should a consultant start using client resources to pursue a personal theory rather than the scope she'd been engaged for. Asked directly whether that was a threat, he smiled, and told her it was advice, that she should finish her certification, sign what was true, and leave the rest to people whose job it actually was. The smile, Nessa thought afterward, was considerably worse than anything he had said aloud. She walked out through the glass corridor with her spine very straight and only noticed, once safely inside the lift, that her hands had begun to shake slightly. the particular aftershock of having said something true to a man who very much did not want to hear it. She sat in her car in the visitor's car park for a long while afterward, engine off, watching the last of the afternoon light move across the reservoir before she trusted herself to drive. She opened her phone to call her mother and closed it again without dialing. Not yet, she told herself. Not until she had something more solid than a feeling and a dead man's borrowed signature to explain why she was calling. The first warning arrived as a flat tire on a construction access road, and Nessa told herself twice, kneeling in the dark to change it, that a nail could find any car anywhere. It was only later that she noticed the puncture had gone in at an angle that made no sense for something simply driven over by accident, too clean, too central, to have been picked up by chance. The second warning left no room for that kind of doubt. She arrived at the office one Thursday to find her desk drawer forced, not broken, just carefully levered, the lock defeated by someone who plainly knew what they were doing. Her personal laptop, left charging overnight, was gone. Her work laptop, cloud-synced and protected behind two-factor authentication, sat untouched right beside the empty space, which told her the thief hadn't been after her files so much as after her, a message, not a theft. Priya urged her, standing close and speaking low, to report it properly to the police rather than just to site security, and Nessa agreed, though she made clear she intended to report considerably more than a stolen laptop. In the days since her meeting with Halloran, she had already, on Priya's advice, quietly backed up every certificate, every clipping, and every written note from the Kowalski and Reese conversations to a personal cloud account under a name that wasn't her own, safely out of reach of any drawer anyone chose to force. The young constable who took her statement, more accustomed to break-ins at the pub than corporate theft at a dam site, admitted there wasn't much to be done that night without evidence tying the break-in to anyone specific, but he took her mention of a possible historical workplace fatality seriously enough to flag it up to his sergeant. His sergeant, Senior Sergeant Owen Reyes, turned out to be worth the flag. Reyes called her the next morning, unhurried and precise, and after hearing her out told her something she had not expected. He had pulled the 1998 file, and there was no record of any Danny Petrakis fatality and no fatality report at all for that site that year, which, given everything she had described, was itself deeply unusual. A worker reported merely injured, when in fact he had died, was not a paperwork slip. It was a body that had never been officially found, in a case that had never been officially opened. Reyes cautioned her carefully. If Halloran Vance had spent 26 years managing this quietly, they would notice fast the moment it stopped being quiet, and he wanted her to keep doing her job, certifying what she honestly could and flagging what she couldn't, and let him worry about the rest. It was good advice, and she meant to take it, right up until that same afternoon, when she found, tucked into a footnote nobody had thought worth deleting, a scheduled inspection port on the chamber's northern wall, installed back in 2003, never once formally decommissioned on any document she could find. Staring at that footnote, she found herself struck by how much of this whole affair had turned, again and again, on exactly this kind of small oversight, not some grand, cinematic conspiracy, but the simple, human failure to erase every last trace across 26 years and several different people's watch. Nobody, it seemed, had ever managed to be careful enough for long enough, and she was beginning to suspect that was very often the only reason the truth ever surfaced at all. When she rang Reyes that evening to pass the footnote on, he was quiet a moment before asking, carefully, whether she had told anyone else at Halloran Vance what she'd found. When she mentioned only a young site engineer named Marcus Choi, Reyes suggested, gently but firmly, that she keep that circle exactly that small while longer. Not because he doubted Marcus, he said, but because the fewer people who knew how close she had come, the fewer chances anyone had to act before he could get a warrant in hand. She sat with a footnote a long time after everyone else had gone home that night, wrote the port number down twice on separate sheets of paper, kept one, and mailed the other to her own address in Brisbane the following morning, because by then, she had stopped trusting any single copy of anything to survive the week. Marcus Choi found her in the archive room 3 days later, the room she technically no longer had access to, though the door still opened to her old code, because nobody had thought to tell facilities otherwise. A small bureaucratic mercy she intended to keep using for as long as it lasted. She braced for the same performance Callan Doyle had given weeks earlier, but Marcus simply closed the door behind him and stood there with his hands in his pockets, looking like a man who had arrived at a decision rather than one defending against being caught. Asked plainly whether he was there to report her or to help her, he told her something that changed the shape of everything she thought she understood about who at Halloran Vance had known what. He had been the site engineer on this handover for 8 months, and he had personally signed off on parts of the 2019 drawing revision that resized the isolation chamber. Doyle had told him at the time it was a structural remediation, filling a void that had developed behind the original wall lining. As a graduate barely 2 years into his career, working under a senior engineer's direction, he'd had no reason to question it. But Denise had mentioned, offhand, that Doyle had asked her the previous week whether the northern inspection port on the chamber wall had ever been formally decommissioned. The very same day, Marcus suspected that Nessa had found that footnote herself. He had pulled the structural specifications the night before and confirmed something that had kept him awake since. The concrete poured into that chamber in 2019 was not remediation fill at all. It was mass concrete, the kind used to permanently encase something nobody ever intended to reach again. Nessa asked, quietly, whether he knew what, or who, might be inside. He admitted he didn't. Too quickly, the answer of a man who had spent several sleepless nights refusing to finish that particular thought. What he did know was that the panel still sat behind a maintenance grate never scheduled for removal, that Doyle had been actively asking about decommissioning it, and that if Doyle sealed it before her review was complete, whatever lay on the other side would become concrete forever, and a family that might still be out there searching would never get the chance to bury him. When Nessa pointed out that she had never told him Danny Petrakis's name, Marcus admitted, after a long moment that might have been shame or might have been relief at finally being asked directly, that Doyle had said it himself weeks earlier, drunk at a work function, long before any of this had come to light. Poor bloody Petrakis, tossed off almost as a joke, laughed away when Marcus had asked what he meant. He hadn't thought anything of it at the time. He had thought of little else since Nessa had started asking questions about the chamber. They needed to reach that panel before Doyle did, Nessa said, and they needed Senior Sergeant Reyes present when it was opened, not arriving afterward. Marcus agreed, slowly, like a man finally stepping off a ledge he had been standing on for some time. There was a scheduled maintenance window that Saturday, when the spillway would be drawn down for planned works, the only time in the next 6 weeks the chamber level would be dry and reachable without tripping an alarm at the control room. If they were doing this, it would have to be Saturday or not for a long while yet. Nessa warned him plainly what it might cost him, his registration, his career, if Halloran decided he made a convenient scapegoat. Marcus told her he didn't much want a career built on what he now suspected it was built on, and that he would rather lose his registration finding out he had been wrong than keep it having never tried to find out at all. Before he left, he told her about the scholarship that had first brought him to Corravale, named for an engineer killed decades earlier in a bridge collapse, the kind of award that came with a lecture every intake on the weight of a signature on a structural document. He used to think that lecture was a formality. He didn't think that anymore. Senior Sergeant Owen Reyes did it properly, which meant it took 2 days longer than Nessa wanted and happened exactly the way it needed to. A magistrate granted a warrant on the strength of Kowalski's statement, Reese's corroborating account, the missing fatality report, and Marcus's technical assessment of the 2019 concrete mix enough, together, to justify accessing a structure on reasonable suspicion that it concealed evidence of an undisclosed workplace death. Saturday arrived gray and still, the reservoir low and glassy beneath the drawn-down maintenance window, the spillway exposed in a way Nessa had never seen it before, wet concrete and old water stains where the flow usually ran. Reyes brought 2 constables and a forensic technician and, after some argument, allowed Nessa and Marcus to remain present as technical advisors, on strict condition that they touch nothing and stand exactly where they were told. The maintenance grate over the northern inspection port came away easily once someone located the fixings, for bolts beneath a skin of grime suggesting nobody had opened it since 2019. Behind it sat the access panel exactly as the old drawings had promised. Round, steel, corroded at the rim, designed to be opened by one person with a wrench in under 10 minutes. It took the technician considerably longer, working carefully, photographing every stage, while Nessa stood with her arms crossed against a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. Marcus stood beside her in the same defensive posture, both of them bracing for a truth they had spent weeks uncovering and only now seemed to fully understand they might not be ready to witness. The chamber beyond was smaller than the old drawings promised, exactly as the resize had suggested, 2/3 of its original footprint, the missing third now a wall of poured concrete that had clearly gone in years after the rest of the room, a visible seam running floor to ceiling where old construction met new. And in the remaining space, half buried beneath decades of settled dust and mineral deposit from slow groundwater seepage, lay a section of collapsed original formwork, rusted rebar, a hard hat carrying a faded company logo, and, folded against the back wall in a way that made Nessa's whole body go still and cold, human remains. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Marcus, very quietly, told Nessa that the concrete surrounding the remains wasn't the original remediation pour at all. It was the 2019 pour, meaning somebody had not simply covered up a death in 1998, but had returned 21 years later when the drawings needed revising for this very handover to make certain the body would never surface during it. Doyle had poured it, Marcus said, his voice carrying an edge Nessa hadn't heard from him before, but Doyle hadn't decided it. Doyle had been 31 years old in 2019, junior enough to be told what to do, senior enough to know exactly what he was doing. There was only one person on this project who had been present since 1998 and still held the authority, in 2019, to order a chamber quietly resized on the eve of a state handover. Nessa was already thinking the name, sitting in her chest like a stone, before Marcus finished the sentence. She looked past the technicians, up toward the glass-fronted office on the ridge above the spillway, and thought of Desmond Halloran standing at that same window with his model dam under perspex, telling her to leave the rest to people whose job it actually was. She told Reyes to move now, before word reached Halloran that they'd found him, and he decided today was the day he stopped being patient. Reyes was already climbing down from the spillway crest before she'd finished speaking, phone at his ear, giving instructions in the flat, rapid voice of a man executing a contingency he had rehearsed without ever quite believing he would need it. One young constable, who had said almost nothing all morning, stood at the chamber entrance afterward with his hat off, an old-fashioned, unconscious gesture, and remarked to no one in particular that his uncle had worked dam sites his whole life, and that you never forget, under all the procedure, that this was somebody. It was, Nessa thought, exactly the thing Desmond Halloran had spent 26 years making sure nobody ever said out loud. They stayed on site well after dark, because leaving felt, for reasons she didn't examine too closely, like abandoning something that had waited 26 years and deserved not to be left alone the moment it was found. Standing with Marcus at the spillway rail while the forensic team worked beneath floodlights, she listened to him say, quietly, that he kept thinking about that graduate lecture on the weight of a signature. He hadn't understood, until tonight, that the weight wasn't a metaphor. It was this. It had always been this. He heard within the hour. A dam site was a small, gossiping ecosystem, and a police vehicle at the spillway on a Saturday, followed by a forensic van, followed by Callan Doyle's phone ringing out twice because Doyle had suddenly and inexplicably left the site, added up quickly for a man who had spent 26 years reading exactly these kinds of signs. Reyes moved faster than Nessa expected. Within 2 hours, he had officers at Doyle's home address, finding it empty, his wife confused, his car gone, and a request already lodged for financial records covering both Halloran Vance Civil and Desmond Halloran personally, built on the payments to the dead Voss and Tran business number that Priya's earlier digging had already handed him, essentially gift-wrapped. Doyle was picked up that evening at a regional airport 2 hours south, attempting to book a same-day flight to a country with no extradition treaty, panicking badly and obviously, a suitcase packed too quickly to have been thought through. He talked, eventually, once his own lawyer made clear that being the man who had poured concrete around a body was a considerably worse position than being the man who could describe who had told him to do it. According to his account, it had begun almost bureaucratically. Voss had died still owed money on an outstanding invoice batch, and Halloran, then still consolidating the company his father had built, and eager to avoid scrutiny of a project already over budget, had simply told the finance team to keep processing the Voss and Tran invoices rather than reopen a messy conversation with a dead man's grieving practice. Doyle, newly hired and eager to please, had been handed the file and told, vaguely, to keep continuity, a phrase never once explained in writing, only implied, again and again, until keeping continuity meant learning to forge a dead man's signature convincingly enough that nobody looked twice. The chamber resize in 2019, Doyle insisted, had been something else entirely, not a slow drift into bad habit, but a direct instruction, issued 3 weeks before the state's preliminary handover inspection, after a routine geotechnical survey flagged unusual settlement readings near the isolation valve chamber. Those readings, Doyle now believed, had in fact been caused by decades of slow decomposition and groundwater movement around Danny Petrakis's remains. He had been told it was a legacy void from the original build, and that filling it was the responsible thing to do before an inspection stumbled onto it and asked questions nobody wanted asked 21 years too late. He swore he hadn't known at the time what he was poring over, though by the time he'd started asking about decommissioning the inspection port only weeks earlier, he knew exactly and had been prepared to seal that too. That last admission mattered more than almost anything else in the case. The difference between a man swept unknowingly into something in 2016 and a man who, with full knowledge in the final weeks, had been actively working to seal the last remaining evidence for good. Reyes charged him accordingly, and Doyle's own defense would spend a great deal of energy trying, largely without success, to keep those two versions of their client from being treated as the same man. When Nessa finally told Priya the full shape of it, Priya landed quickly on the detail that troubled her most. The payments had stopped 8 months earlier, right around when the unsettling geotechnical readings had started, the exact moment Halloran understood a stalling certificate would no longer be enough, and that only something permanent would do. It was Priya, in the weeks that followed, who unearthed the last small cruelty buried in the file, a note in Halloran's own subpoenaed diary, dated the same week as the geotechnical survey, reading only 7 words, "Sort chamber before state water." Behind those 7 words sat a man's entire willingness, in his 60s, with everything to lose and nothing left to protect but his own comfort, to bury a second wrong directly on top of the first. There was, Nessa found a strange, unwelcome relief in hearing Doyle's confession laid out this plainly, not because it excused him, but because it confirmed that the flinch she'd noticed on his face in the archive room had been exactly what she'd suspected, and that her own instincts had not, in the end, been wrong. Reyes told her, in a rare unguarded moment, that most people who stumbled onto something like this either said nothing out of fear, or said everything too soon and gave the guilty party time to clean up before any charge could stick. She had done neither. She had built a file a prosecutor could actually use, and that, he told her, was rarer than she might think. Desmond Halloran did not run. Nessa thought about that a great deal afterward. That a man who had managed a secret for 26 years with total, unhurried confidence chose, in the end, to sit in his glass office above the reservoir and wait for Reyes to come to him, as though some part of him had always known this day would arrive. She wasn't present for the arrest. She heard about it secondhand, from Priya, who heard it from Marcus, who watched from the spillway crest as two unmarked cars came up the access road at a speed that told everyone watching exactly what they were. What emerged over the following months was a story both simpler and considerably worse than she had imagined. Danny Petrakis had died in 1998 in a collapse caused directly by the company pushing a concrete cure time it should never have pushed, under pressure from a state client eager for good headlines on a flagship project. A young Desmond Halloran, 30 years old and desperate to prove himself to a father who still controlled the company, had made a choice in the panicked hours after Danny's death that he would spend the rest of his life protecting, to bury the body inside the chamber, to falsify the honest incident report Kowalski had written, and to invent a recovery and return home to a family that had never received a cent, never learned the truth, and had spent 26 years believing their son had simply cut contact, too ashamed of the estrangement to look any harder. It was Danny's sister, Elena Petrakis, 49 and living in Townsville, whom Nessa eventually met at Reyes's suggestion. Elena had spent her adult life believing her brother had simply walked away from the family. The truth, that he had died at 24, entombed in a wall for the sake of a schedule and a reputation, was not, she admitted, better than the story she had told herself for 26 years. Just true, finally, and that, she said, had to be worth something, even at this cost. Elena asked, gently, whether Nessa's own father had known anything about Danny. Nessa had wondered the same thing throughout the investigation, combing through her father's old union records and speaking to surviving colleagues from the 1998 crew who remembered a quiet rigger who'd left the trade abruptly the following year and never explained why. She found no proof he'd known anything specific, nothing beyond a jaw that tightened at a single-place name for the rest of his life. She told Elena, finally, that she believed her father had known something had happened, enough to be afraid of it, though perhaps not enough to fix it, and that this was its own particular kind of guilt, one that didn't need proof to be real. She thought of the toy crane he'd made her from offcuts, of him standing at that kitchen window looking north, and decided it was probably why he had never worked heavy construction again, though probably not why he had never told her. That part, she suspected, was simply the times, what men of his generation did with things they couldn't carry and didn't know how to put down. Desmond Halloran was convicted, 18 months later, of manslaughter, perverting the course of justice, and a raft of fraud charges connected to the falsified certificates and the 26 years of payments made to a dead engineer's firm, payments that had never actually gone to Voss's estate at all, but to a shell account Halloran had personally controlled, using the dead man's identity as a laundering channel disguised as professional continuity. Callan Doyle, having cooperated with investigators, received a substantially reduced sentence for the fraud charges and a separate, considerably harsher one for his attempt, in the final weeks, to destroy evidence. The company did not survive the verdict in any form its founders would have recognized. Halloran Van Civil was placed into administration within the year, its major contracts reassigned, its board, mostly Halloran's own appointees, who claimed under oath to have known nothing, dissolved amid a state parliamentary inquiry that Nessa was asked, twice, to give evidence to. She attended both times, answered exactly what was asked and nothing more, and came away with the same weary sense that an inquiry could recommend reform without ever quite giving anyone back the years a lie had already cost them. State Water Queensland, for its part, quietly overhauled its own completions verification process in the aftermath, introducing an independent third-party signature audit for every major infrastructure handover going forward, a small, unglamorous piece of bureaucracy that Nessa privately considered the one unambiguously good thing to come directly out of the entire affair. A door closed, not on one company's crime, but on the next one's opportunity. The trial took 11 days, in a Brisbane courtroom that smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and old paper, and Nessa spent 2 of those days in the witness box, walking a jury of 12 strangers through metadata timestamps and signature comparisons and the particular shape of a lie built entirely out of documents rather than words. The prosecution's case rested on exactly the kind of evidence Nessa had spent a career learning to read, not confessions or dramatic revelations, but a patient accumulation of dates that didn't match, payments that continued long past a death, and a drawing set that shrank a room the same year a stalling tactic finally ran out of road. Halloran's defense argued that Doyle had acted alone, that a chairman couldn't be expected to personally track every archived certificate, and that the concrete poor order had been a legitimate remediation instruction, badly misinterpreted. It was Ted Kowalski's testimony, Nessa thought afterward, that did the most damage to that defense. An old man in an ill-fitting suit, describing a 26-year-old conversation with a precision that came not from a good memory, but from a memory forced to replay itself thousands of times, alone, on a porch in Yapun, because there had never before been anyone to tell it to. He recounted Halloran's exact words about the settlement, and the threat about never working another Queensland site, in a voice that never once shook, and Nessa watched 2 jurors quietly write things down as he spoke. Elena Petrakis testified on the 9th day, briefly, describing a brother who loved welding jokes nobody else found funny, and who had promised, the last time she'd spoken to him, to come home for Christmas.
She did not cry on the stand.
She told the court afterward she had already done all her crying, years earlier, grieving a brother she believed had simply chosen to disappear. Nessa's own testimony was, by comparison, almost dry dates, documents, the mechanics of a completions review, the exact moment she had first noticed a dead man's signature on a living certificate. But stepping down from the box on her 2nd day, she caught Desmond Halloran's eye across the courtroom, the only time in the entire trial their eyes actually met, and found in his face, for once, not the smooth, warm menace of his office above the reservoir, but something smaller and older, a man who had spent 26 years being very good at not getting caught, and had finally, entirely, run out of room to keep being good at it. Marcus testified on the 10th day, walking the jury through the concrete, mixed design with a patience Nessa recognized as hard-won. Priya was never called. Her evidence had already gone in as documents, the invoice trail speaking for itself, but she came to the courtroom anyway, most days, sitting near the back of the gallery, telling Nessa afterward that she'd simply wanted to see the end of it with her own eyes. Callan Doyle pleaded guilty in a separate, shorter hearing the week before the main trial began. He looked smaller than she remembered, grayer, and when the magistrate asked whether he had anything to say before sentencing, he spoke for less than a minute, mostly about his children, and did not once look toward the small public gallery where Elena Petrakis sat with her hands folded very still in her lap. The jury deliberated for a day and a half. When the foreperson finally read the verdicts, Nessa was not in the courtroom to hear it. Unable to sit through the reading, she had gone outside and stood on the courthouse steps in the Brisbane heat until Reyes came out and found her there and told her plainly, without ceremony, that it was done, guilty on every count that mattered. She did not feel triumphant. She had expected, somewhere across the long months of the investigation, that a verdict would feel like an ending, a door closing with a satisfying weight. Instead, it felt like exactly what it was. A fact finally entered into a record that had been falsified for 26 years, important and necessary, and, in the end, no substitute at all for the 24-year-old man it could never bring back. Reyes drove her back to her hotel that evening, an unnecessary kindness she suspected he offered because he understood, better than most, that a verdict is not the same thing as closure, and that people sometimes need a quiet car and an undemanding companion far more than they need congratulations. It doesn't always feel like this, he told her, pulling up outside. Sometimes a verdict feels like winning. This one, he said, was never going to. Too much of it had already been lost long before she ever arrived. Nessa finished her contract 11 weeks late, which nobody at State Water Queensland held against her once they understood why. The Corravale Dam remediation was recertified under new project leadership, the isolation valve chamber rebuilt properly, its access port left deliberately, permanently unobstructed, on Nessa's own written recommendation, a small, stubborn insistence that no chamber on this site would ever again become a place where something could quietly be made to disappear. She signed the final completion certificate herself on a gray Tuesday in her last week on site, in the very same archive room where she'd first found Walter Voss's forged signature 5 months earlier. Setting the pen down, it felt like closing a very long, very heavy door, not on the grief, which never entirely closes, but on the dishonesty that had let that grief go unacknowledged for 26 years. Marcus stayed on, eventually promoted into the senior structural role Doyle had once held, a promotion, he told her, with the dry humor she'd come to appreciate in him, he would gladly have earned any other way. He and Priya kept in touch afterward, the occasional message, a card at Christmas, the loose, easy correspondence of people who no longer needed to perform the friendship to know it was real. Elena Petrakis buried her brother at last, in a small service in Townsville that Nessa attended at Elena's invitation, standing at the back of a modest chapel while a priest who had never known Danny spoke gently about a life cut short at 24 and a family's long, undeserved wait for the truth. Ted Kowalski drove up from Yapun and stood near the front with the particular stillness of a man finally laying down something he had carried alone for 26 years. Alan Reese sent flowers, and a note Nessa never read the contents of, because it hadn't been addressed to her. Walter Voss's own family, his widow and 2 adult children, were, in the end, among the case's quieter casualties, a good engineer's name used for years to launder a fraud he had never committed and could not, from the grave, defend himself against. Once the trial concluded, Nessa wrote to them, unprompted, wanting someone to tell them plainly that the one certificate Walter Voss had ever signed dishonestly, back in 2003, had been the act of a frightened, compromised man inside a company that had already made its worst choice before he'd ever picked up the pen, and that everything signed in his name after his death had been done to him, not by him. His widow wrote back 3 weeks later, a short letter thanking her for the honesty and asking for nothing else. Driving out of Corravale for the last time, past the lookout where she'd once stood alone on her first night, Nessa found herself thinking of her father at that same kitchen window, 26 years carrying a name he had never once said aloud. She would never know for certain whether he had carried a specific guilt or only a general one, whether Danny Petrakis had ever been more to him than a shape in the corner of one bad summer he wanted badly to forget. But she thought, whatever it had actually been, that he would have wanted this. The true report filed at last over the false one, a certificate that finally meant exactly what it said. She stopped at the lookout one final time before leaving, engine idling, and took the folded photograph from her notebook. Her father, sunburnt, grinning under a hard hat, an arm around a stranger she would likely never identify. She didn't leave it there. She put it back and drove on, deciding that some things a person carries forward rather than leaves behind. Somewhere behind her, the dam went on holding the reservoir exactly as it always had, concrete and steel doing the quiet, unglamorous work it had been built to do. It had never been the structure that lied. It had only ever been the people signing for it, and that distinction was the whole of her job, and quite possibly the whole of everything, that the paper had to match the world, and when it didn't, somebody eventually had to be the one willing to notice. Her next contract took her to a water treatment upgrade outside Toowoomba, ordinary, well-documented, entirely free of dead men's signatures, as far as she could tell. She caught herself, on her very first morning, checking a completion date against a registration number out of pure habit before she'd even finished her coffee. Farrakha's old lesson had stopped being a piece of workplace wisdom and become something closer to a discipline she meant to carry for the rest of her career. That a certificate was never really about the concrete at all. It was a promise, made on paper by one person to everyone who came after them, and somebody, always, had to be willing to check whether the promise had actually been kept. And that brings us to the end of the final certificate here on Emavira Audiobooks. What stays with us about this one isn't the forgery, or even the chamber beneath the spillway. It's the sheer number of ordinary, decent people who found themselves quietly deciding over 26 years whether to say something or say nothing, and who had to live with whichever choice they made. A foreman who wrote an honest report nobody wanted. A draftsman who kept a confession to himself for 2 decades. A young engineer who chose to risk everything he'd worked for rather than keep signing his name to something he no longer trusted. And one woman, new to a town that wasn't hers, who simply couldn't stop looking at a signature that didn't add up. It's a story about how thoroughly a lie can be maintained by people who convince themselves each individual choice is small, and about how much courage it takes, in the end, for one person to insist the paperwork actually has to match the truth. Nothing about Nessa Kirwan's job was dramatic. It was patient, careful, unglamorous work. And it was exactly that patience that got a family, 26 years late, an answer they deserved from the very beginning. If this story moved you, we'd love to know. Leave us a comment. Tell us which moment landed hardest. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Emavira Audiobooks so you don't miss the next case we bring you. Thank you, as always, for spending this time with us. Until next time, this has been Emavira Audiobooks. Take care of yourselves, and we'll see you in the next story.